We continue with our Discernment of Spirits Mondays, and we had begun speaking about Rule 10, Spiritual Consolation, a time to prepare. And if you remember, we began saying how actually the first thing we do when we're in consolation is not so much to begin to prepare for desolation, but just to receive. We receive the gift and enjoy it. We had read that quote from Elizabeth Seton, how she said after being kind of in nature and really encountering the Lord, how she says, I am sure in the 2 hours so enjoyed grew 10 years in the spiritual life, right? She's in the presence of the Lord receiving a strong time of consolation. And so she just enjoys those 2 hours. And just by doing that, she's growing a lot spiritually because she is growing in intimacy with the Lord. So the first thing, again, is receiving. However, as the intensity of a consolation maybe just kind of wanes a little bit and we remain maybe after that in a sense just of peace, maybe through the rest of the day or the next couple of days, then it's the time to begin to apply this Rule 10 of preparing for the time of desolation that is surely to come later on again. And St. Ignatius says in this rule, think how one will behave when in desolation. So one of the ways in which we prepare while in consolation is just to think ahead and say, hey, I'm going to be in desolation at some point again, and how am I going to behave when I'm there? This sort of kind of thinking does not really come spontaneously. Similarly to how you may remember some of the rules we covered before, you're in desolation, and St. Ignatius invites you to think in a particular way to fight desolation. This sort of thinking does not come spontaneously. You have to kind of be intentional about it. So the same thing in consolation. You may be in consolation and say, oh, I'm doing great. I don't need to be thinking about anything else. But yet, if one prepares, then one will not be surprised. And so when desolation comes, one will be able to fight and not be surprised. And it'll be easier to not be in that state for very long, as opposed to being really shocked or surprised by it. And then be like, Lord, like, is this how you treat me, etc., right? Now, St. Ignatius does not give us specific practical ways on how to think during this time of consolation about preparing for desolation, but Father Gallagher in his book does give some suggestions, about 8 or so. I'm just going to give you 4 of them for you to consider. The first thing is you can pray, right, for strength for future desolation. So when we're in consolation, we feel really close to the Lord, and so we can say, hey Lord, if ever later on I feel kind of down or I don't feel your presence, please help me, please be with me, right? And we can already pray, and we can actually also be very specific. Let's say one knows oneself that one tends to get discouraged when you start a project, and that's when you usually fall into desolation. So maybe you're in consolation, you're about to start a project, and so you can be specific, Lord, as I'm starting this project, I know you're with me. So if I start feeling that you're not, let me remember that you are with me as I'm experiencing you right now, right? So a prayer of petition for future desolation is the first thing we can do. Second thing, we can meditate on truths that will sustain us in desolation. So maybe we can meditate on God's faithfulness, especially in consolation. We're really we're seeing clearly how faithful God is. Usually in consolation, we're like, Lord, you're so good. You're so faithful. So if we meditate on that, just the fact that the Lord is faithful, or something that can help us later on, when we're in desolation, we can be like, no, well, last week I had this clarity about your faithfulness, Lord, right? And so it will help you, right, see with more clarity during desolation, because during consolation, you were diving deep into these truths of who the Lord is, and truths that will sustain you during desolation. Third thing is resolution to not make changes, right? You may remember Rule 5 is that you don't make changes during desolation regarding spiritual practices that you're doing. And so you can kind of make a resolution, hey, if I ever kind of come back to desolation, I'm not going to change these spiritual practices that I'm doing right now, kind of making that choice even before desolation comes. And the last thing that I leave you today with is reviewing the rule. During consolation, you can review the rules, just kind of dive deeper into them, that you have them more kind of at the front of your mind for when desolation comes. Because if you don't know the rules, then you fall into desolation and then you don't know how to fight. Or if you're in consolation, you're reviewing the rules a little bit, then it can help you at time to prepare for how to behave when desolation comes. So this is Rule 10, consolation at time to prepare.